Embarrassed by his wife, the man decides to take his mistress to a meeting with foreigners, but when he discovers the surprise that. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. Edward Hamilton was the epitome of success in the business world. At 43, he was the CEO of a thriving tech startup in Manhattan, living in a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park. Yet, despite his professional accomplishments, his personal life was anything but fulfilling. His marriage to Samantha, a sharp-witted but overly critical woman, had long since lost its spark. Conversations had become arguments, shared moments reduced to brief exchanges of disdain. For Edward, Samantha's disdain was most evident in her outright dismissal of his achievements. "Another investor dinner?" she would sneer. "Do you ever think about the toll this is taking on us?" To her, his work was a distraction. To him, it was his salvation. It was during one of these investor dinners that Edward met Lisa Carter. A rising star in corporate law, Lisa was everything Samantha wasn't: youthful, vibrant, and openly admiring of Edward's ambitions. Their professional meetings soon turned into late-night drinks, and before long, a clandestine affair bloomed. Lisa made him feel alive again, a dangerous allure he couldn't resist. When a major opportunity arose to secure funding from a group of European investors, Edward was tasked with hosting an exclusive dinner to seal the deal. It was a career-defining moment, and he dreaded the thought of Samantha attending and berating him afterward. That's when the idea struck. He would take Lisa instead. The logistics were simple but risky. Edward would tell Samantha the dinner was strictly for colleagues and not a +1 event. Meanwhile, he reassured Lisa that their presence as a couple at such a high-profile gathering would remain discreet. Lisa hesitated but eventually agreed, charmed by Edward's confidence and the prospect of being part of his glamorous world. On the night of the event, Edward dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, the perfect picture of charm and sophistication. He picked up Lisa in a sleek black car, her appearance equally stunning in a fitted navy blue dress. "Tonight's going to be perfect," he told her, his voice brimming with confidence. Lisa smiled, but couldn't shake a gnawing sense of unease. The dinner was set in the private room of an upscale French restaurant in Midtown, a place renowned for its exclusivity. As Edward and Lisa arrived, the maitre d' ushered them in with practiced elegance. The room was already filled with the low hum of conversation, the clink of wine glasses, and the aroma of fine cuisine. Edward felt a surge of pride as the investors greeted him warmly. Lisa, too, was the picture of charm, her witty remarks and insightful comments captivating the guests. Edward watched her with a mixture of pride and relief. This was exactly what he had envisioned: a flawless evening that showcased his success and left Samantha none the wiser. Yet, as the evening progressed, subtle cracks began to form. One of the investors, a jovial older man named Heinrich, leaned in during a toast and mentioned something that caught Edward off guard. "You know, your wife, she is a remarkable woman. You're lucky to have her." Edward froze, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Heinrich couldn't possibly know about Samantha, could he? He brushed it off with a polite laugh, but the unease lingered. By the time dessert was served, Edward's nerves were on edge. Heinrich wasn't the only one who had made odd remarks. Another investor had mentioned a surprise waiting for Edward later. Despite his growing unease, Edward clung to his confidence. Whatever it was, he would handle it. After all, tonight was his night, or so he thought. The days leading up to the dinner had been a balancing act for Edward, a carefully orchestrated performance to ensure that Samantha and Lisa remained in their separate spheres. Each interaction was weighed, each word chosen with precision. To Samantha, he was the busy husband, consumed by work, but still dutiful. To Lisa, He was the ambitious partner, willing to risk everything to be with her. However, Samantha had begun noticing cracks in his facade. Edward's abrupt phone calls, late-night meetings, and recent emotional distance were impossible to ignore. She had always been perceptive, her sharp intellect honed by years of observing people. What Edward dismissed as a typical marital spat, Samantha saw as a sign of something deeper. She decided to dig. Meanwhile, Edward juggled his dual life with increasing difficulty. He meticulously planned the dinner, selecting the perfect venue, arranging the guest list, and ensuring that Lisa would blend seamlessly with the group. She was a risk, but one he was willing to take. Her charisma and intellect would complement his polished charm, creating the perfect image for the investors. On the day of the event, Edward felt the weight of the charade pressing down on him. Samantha had asked innocently over breakfast, "Are you sure I shouldn't come tonight?" It sounds like an important event. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes held a glint of suspicion. Edward forced a smile. "It's strictly business," he replied. "These investors want to talk numbers, not meet spouses." "You'd be bored out of your mind," Samantha smiled back, her expression unreadable. "Of course, dear. You know best." What Edward didn't realize was that Samantha had already uncovered some details about his activities. A glance at his text messages left carelessly on his phone during one of his meetings had revealed more than enough to confirm her suspicions. But she wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. Samantha had a plan, and it required patience. Lisa, on the other hand, began showing signs of doubt. The idea of attending the dinner as Edward's date initially excited her, but the closer the day came, the more apprehensive she grew. "What if someone recognizes me as your lawyer? It could look unprofessional," she had warned him the day before. Edward had brushed off her concerns. "These people don't care about that. All they'll see is a beautiful, intelligent woman who makes me look even more impressive. Trust me, Lisa, this will be good for both of us." Lisa had reluctantly agreed, but as the evening approached, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were playing with fire. At the dinner, Edward's meticulous planning seemed to pay off. The investors were charmed by Lisa's eloquence and knowledge of global markets. Her confidence shone, and Edward felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly what he needed: a flawless performance to secure the deal and stroke his ego. But the cracks in his carefully constructed world began to widen. Heinrich, the jovial investor, leaned in during the main course to share another cryptic remark. "Your wife, Samantha, mentioned how proud she is of you. She's quite the conversationalist, you know." Edward's stomach dropped. "I didn't realize you'd met Samantha," he replied cautiously. "Oh, not in person," Heinrich said with a wave of his hand. "She sent a delightful email introducing herself." "Quite insightful." Edward forced a laugh, but his mind raced. Samantha knew about the dinner? Why hadn't she mentioned the email? Was she testing him? His composure began to crack under the weight of these unanswered questions. As dessert was served, Lisa whispered to Edward, "You're tense." "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied, his voice tight. "Just focusing on the investors." Lisa studied his face, clearly unconvinced. The evening's final twist came as the maitre d' entered the room with a polished air. "Mr. Hamilton, a special guest has just arrived." "They're waiting in the lobby." Edward's pulse quickened. "A guest?" "I wasn't expecting anyone else. I was told they were a surprise," the maitre d' replied smoothly. Lisa looked at Edward, her expression shifting to one of alarm. Who could it be? Edward didn't have an answer. The meticulously planned evening was slipping from his control, and he could feel the walls closing in. "Stay here," he whispered to Lisa as he rose from his seat, his heart pounding. What awaited him in the lobby would unravel everything he had worked so hard to conceal. Edward's heart raced as he made his way to the restaurant lobby. The grand hallway seemed longer than usual, its marble floors echoing the click of his polished shoes. His mind cycled through possibilities: an unexpected investor, a journalist, or worse, someone tied to Samantha. The maitre d's cryptic announcement offered no clues, leaving Edward to drown in uncertainty. As he approached the lobby, the sight that greeted him drained the color from his face. Standing there, poised and composed, was Samantha, clad in a sleek black dress that exuded confidence. Beside her stood Mark Reynolds, a renowned attorney whose sharp reputation preceded him. The sight of the two together was a dagger to Edward's chest. "Edward," Samantha greeted, her voice icy yet polite, carrying just enough venom to unsettle him. "What a pleasant surprise. I thought this was a work event, but I couldn't resist stopping by." He forced a smile, struggling to regain his composure. "Samantha, what are you doing here?" "And Mark?" Mark offered a firm handshake, his expression unreadable. "Good evening, Edward. Samantha mentioned you'd be hosting tonight. We were nearby and thought we'd say hello." Edward's mind scrambled. What game was she playing? Her sudden appearance couldn't be coincidental, and bringing Mark along felt like a calculated move. He could practically feel the ground beneath him shift. "Well," he began, his voice strained, "this is a bit unexpected. We're in the middle of a private dinner for investors. Of course," Samantha said smoothly, her tone laced with mock sweetness. "But as your wife, I figured I'd show my support. After all, I wouldn't want to miss a moment of your success." The sarcasm in her words wasn't lost on Edward. He glanced toward the private room where the investors were undoubtedly wondering about his absence. He needed to get rid of her quickly and quietly. "Samantha," he said in a low voice, stepping closer to her, "this isn't the time or place. We can talk later." But Samantha wasn't budging. "Oh, don't worry, Edward. I have no intention of disturbing your dinner. Mark and I will just have a quick word with your guests, and then we'll be on our way." Edward's chest tightened. "You can't be serious." "Completely," Samantha replied, her gaze cutting through him. Before Edward could protest further, Samantha turned on her heel and strode toward the private dining room, Mark following close behind. Panic surged through Edward as he hurried after them. Inside, the investors were mid-conversation, their laughter filling the air, but their attention quickly shifted to the trio entering the room. Lisa's smile faltered the moment she saw Samantha. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samantha began, her voice carrying across the room, "I'm Samantha Hamilton, Edward's wife. I just wanted to personally thank you all for being here tonight and for supporting my husband's ventures." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Lisa's face drained of color, her eyes darting toward Edward, who stood frozen in the doorway, his carefully crafted facade crumbling. One of the investors, Heinrich, broke the silence with a light chuckle. "Well, this is a delightful surprise. Edward, you didn't mention your wife would be joining us." Edward stammered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I didn't expect her to, stop by." Samantha smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I'm full of surprises." Her gaze flickered to Lisa, who looked as though she wanted to disappear into the floor. "And you must be," Samantha continued, addressing Lisa with feigned curiosity. Lisa, visibly flustered, rose from her seat. "I'm Lisa Carter, one of Edward's colleagues," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Colleague," Samantha repeated, her tone deliberately ambiguous. "How wonderful. It's always nice to meet the people who support Edward in his work." Edward felt as though the room was shrinking around him. The investors exchanged glances, their polite expressions giving way to unease. Samantha's poised demeanor made it clear she was in control, while Edward's silence only deepened the tension. Mark, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. "I think it's admirable, Samantha, how supportive you are of Edward. And Lisa, it's clear you're very committed to the company's success." Lisa's eyes widened and Edward shot him a glare. The insinuation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Samantha let the moment linger before adding, "Well, I won't keep you all any longer. Edward, Mark, and I will leave you to your business. But perhaps we'll talk more at home?" With that, she turned and strode toward the exit, Mark trailing behind. Lisa sank back into her chair, her face flushed with humiliation. As Edward moved to follow Samantha out, Heinrich's voice stopped him. "Edward," he said, raising an eyebrow, "perhaps you'd like to explain what's going on." Edward turned back to the room, his mind a whirlwind of panic and regret. The perfect evening he had envisioned was slipping through his fingers, and the night was far from over. Edward stood frozen, his carefully constructed facade in tatters. The weight of Heinrich's question hung in the air, amplified by the oppressive silence from the other investors. Every eye in the room was on him, a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and judgment reflecting back at him. Lisa sat rigid, her gaze fixed on the polished table as though it might somehow shield her from the unraveling disaster. "Edward," Heinrich pressed, his voice firm but measured, "is there something we should know?" Edward cleared his throat, scrambling for a response. "This is just a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual authority. "My wife had no intention of interrupting tonight's proceedings. I assure you, everything is under control, but nothing was under control." Lisa, sensing the eyes on her, finally broke the silence. "Perhaps we should focus on the business at hand," she offered weakly, her tone betraying her unease. Before anyone could respond, the door to the private dining room opened once more. The maitre d' entered, his demeanor composed, but with an air of discomfort. "Mr. Hamilton, apologies for the intrusion, but your wife has requested a moment of your time in the lobby." Edward's heart sank further. Samantha wasn't done. He nodded curtly and followed the maitre d' out, leaving behind a room buzzing with whispered speculation. When he reached the lobby, Samantha was waiting, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," she said, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. "But it seems your dinner is quite the event." Edward clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his composure. "What are you trying to accomplish here, Samantha?" he hissed. She leaned in slightly, her voice low but cutting. "I just thought it was time your perfect little world got a dose of reality." "Don't act so surprised, Edward. Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your extracurricular activities?" He opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off with a cold laugh. "Save it," she snapped. "I've known about Lisa for weeks. The late nights, the vague excuses, you're not nearly as clever as you think. And tonight?" She glanced toward the dining room. "Well, let's just say you'll be reaping what you've sown." Edward felt the walls closing in around him. "Samantha," he began, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. "Let's not do this here. We can talk at home." "Oh, we'll talk," she replied, stepping back with a satisfied look. "But for now, I think I'll leave you to handle the fallout." Before he could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, her presence as commanding in departure as it had been in arrival. Edward returned to the dining room, his mind racing with damage control strategies. He forced a tight smile as he re-entered, but the room's atmosphere had shifted. The investors sat stiffly, their expressions guarded. Lisa avoided his gaze entirely, her once confident demeanor replaced with quiet mortification. Heinrich, ever the spokesman, broke the tension. "Edward," he began slowly, "while we understand that personal matters can be complicated, transparency is paramount in our business. Trust is the foundation of any partnership." Edward nodded, his palm sweating. "I couldn't agree more," he said, his voice strained. "And I assure you, my personal life will never interfere with our professional relationship." Heinrich exchanged glances with the other investors. "We hope that's true," he said pointedly. As the dinner limped toward its conclusion, the camaraderie that had defined the earlier part of the evening was gone. Edward's charm no longer held its sway, replaced by an awkward stiffness. The investors excused themselves one by one, offering polite but terse farewells. When the last of them had left, Edward slumped into a chair, the weight of the night finally crashing down on him. Lisa, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, her voice trembling. Edward looked at her, his frustration giving way to pleading. "Lisa, I'll fix this. I just need time." She shook her head, rising from her seat. "Time won't fix what you've done, Edward. I didn't know you were still this involved with Samantha. You lied to me, just like you lied to everyone else tonight. Lisa, wait." But she didn't wait. She grabbed her coat and left without another word, leaving Edward alone in the empty dining room. The enormity of his choices hit him like a tidal wave. He had lost control of his marriage, his relationship with Lisa, and possibly the trust of the investors who could make or break his career. The perfect life he had crafted was now a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. As Edward sat in the dimly lit room, the reality of his downfall began to set in. But the night was not over yet. Edward spent the remainder of the night in a haze of despair. The lavish private dining room, once filled with laughter and promise, now felt like a tomb. He stared at the empty glasses and abandoned plates, each one a bitter reminder of how quickly his carefully orchestrated life had unraveled. His phone buzzed on the table, its screen lighting up with a message from Samantha. "We'll talk in the morning." "Bring a lawyer." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Samantha's threat was clear, her intent unmistakable. The life he had taken for granted was slipping away, and Edward could do little to stop it. The next morning, Edward arrived at his penthouse to find Samantha waiting for him in the living room, Mark Reynolds seated beside her. The air was thick with tension as Edward entered, his suit disheveled and his confidence shattered. "Good morning," Samantha said coolly, her voice devoid of warmth. "We have a lot to discuss." Edward tried to maintain a veneer of control. "Samantha, we don't need lawyers. We can handle this privately." Mark cleared his throat, his expression calm but authoritative. "Edward, Samantha has every right to legal counsel, given the circumstances. And from what I've seen, those circumstances are quite serious." Samantha leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Did you really think you could humiliate me and get away with it? That I wouldn't find out about your little affair?" Edward's voice faltered. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Samantha. I made a mistake." Her laugh was cold, cutting through his excuse like a knife. "A mistake? No, Edward. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. This was deliberate, deceptive. And now you're going to face the consequences." She slid a folder across the table toward him. "These are the terms of our divorce. You'll find them generous, given your behavior." Edward opened the folder, his hands trembling. The terms were clear. Samantha would retain the majority of their shared assets, including the penthouse. She also demanded a substantial alimony payment. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "You can't expect me to agree to this." Samantha met his outburst with a calm smile. You have no leverage, Edward. The investors from last night? I've already spoken to Heinrich. Let's just say your reputation won't recover easily from this. The mention of the investors sent a fresh wave of dread through Edward. The deal he had spent months cultivating was slipping away, just like everything else. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Samantha had thought of everything. Every misstep, every lie, every deception, she had turned it all into a weapon. Edward, once so sure of his ability to control every aspect of his life, was now at her mercy. After hours of negotiation, he finally signed the papers, his signature shaky and reluctant. Samantha gathered the documents and rose to leave, Mark following close behind. "Goodbye, Edward," she said, pausing at the door. "I hope this teaches you something about respect. For yourself and for others." When the door closed behind her, Edward was left alone in the echoing silence of the penthouse. The weight of his choices bore down on him like never before. His career, his marriage, and his reputation were in shambles. For weeks, Edward avoided the outside world, retreating into the confines of his empty home. The few calls he received from colleagues confirmed his fears. The investors had pulled out of the deal. Lisa, too, had severed all contact. He was a pariah, left to face the wreckage of his own making. But as the days turned into weeks, Edward began to confront the harsh truths about himself. His arrogance, his selfishness, his need for validation, they had driven him to betray the people who mattered most. One evening, he sat in the silence of his penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city that had once been his playground now felt cold and indifferent. He reached for a pen and a notebook, the act of writing offering a small semblance of purpose. "I destroyed my life chasing an illusion," he wrote. "But maybe there's still time to rebuild." The words felt hollow, but they were a start. Months later, Edward Ray emerged into the world. He sold the penthouse, donated a portion of the proceeds to charity, and moved to a modest apartment in Brooklyn. He took on consulting work, slowly rebuilding his professional reputation. And while his relationship with Samantha was beyond repair, he sent her a letter, a genuine apology for the pain he had caused. He knew it wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step toward redemption. In the end, Edward learned that his downfall was not an end, but a painful beginning. The life he had so meticulously built had crumbled, but from the ruins, he found a chance to start again, not as the man he once was, but as the man he hoped to become.